Welcome into the Jazz Notes podcast. I'm your host, Ben Anderson, rolling solo today. Chandler Holt will be back with us again next week. As always, appreciate you following me on Twitter at Ben's Hoops. You can also find me on Instagram. You can read me at kslsports.com. Follow us at KSL Sports on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Threads, wherever you get your social media. Just look up KSL Sports, and we will be there. As always, we'll start off with a little bit of Jazz news. I will talk about some NBA draft prospects with the NBA draft coming up a week from now, and then I guess technically a week from tomorrow, recording this on Tuesday, June 18th, and then we will break down your mailbag questions. Got a lot today, so excited to get to those. Quickly, let's just get to the tip times for the Utah Jazz when it comes to the Summer League. That was the little piece of news that we got this week. The Jazz, of course, going to be taking part in the Salt Lake City Summer League, one of 4 teams, as has become custom over the last several years. July 8th, as opposed to doing it the first week of July. They're now doing it July 8th. Generally, they kind of do it over the 4th of July holiday. This year they're doing it a week later before the Las Vegas Summer League. 5 p.m. Mountain Time, Oklahoma City on the road. Technically, again, they're the road team against Philadelphia 76ers. And then the Jazz will host Memphis that first night. Second night, July 9th, Grizzlies take on the 76ers. The Jazz will host the Thunder at 7 p.m. And then July 10th, Grizzlies face the Thunder, and the Jazz will host the 76ers. The cool thing about this, again, a lot of lottery talent. This isn't just, kind of the back-end champion first-round teams sending their 29th and 30th picks to Salt Lake. There's a good lottery talent here, and maybe somewhat surprisingly because we didn't expect the Grizzlies to be a lottery team this season, and Oklahoma City's just going to have lottery picks despite the fact that they made the playoffs and had the best record in the Western Conference. But the Grizzlies own the 9th pick, Jazz own the 10th pick, Thunder own the 12th pick. So 3 lottery picks, again, expected to come to Salt Lake City, and then, Philly barely avoided the play-in, so they've got the 16th pick in the draft, so that's just outside the lottery. That's where Keontae George was selected last year. Jazz have the 29th pick, so you're going to see a lot of young talent here in Salt Lake City. Single-game packages available, 3-game packages available, whatever you're looking for tickets. So pretty cool with that. I'm always excited to cover the Summer League. I like the access fans get. I like the access the media gets. And should be very cool. I think it's a great thing that the Utah Jazz host this and have done it for so long, even going back to the Rocky Mountain Review. I did watch some more draft prospects this week. Let's see. I'm trying to do it off the top of my head. I've probably written up 15, 14, something like that, player breakdowns. So you can always read those at kslsports.com. For the players that are projected to be selected at 10, where the Jazz are, right in that range, I did a lot more in-depth breakdowns and then how they would fit with the Jazz. And as I've looked at some of the guys that are projected to be selected really just after where the Jazz are picking, and I'm not just looking at guys 25 to 35 because I think anything could happen on draft night. The Jazz could trade up, the Jazz could trade out. I'm just trying to make sure there's kind of a general knowledge of who all these players are, both for myself and our draft coverage at KSL Sports on 97.5. But also just for my knowledge of these players coming into the league, I did a little bit shorter breakdown. So 2 guys who I did long breakdowns on because there's a real chance they get drafted in the lottery and right around where the Jazz are drafting at number 10 were Nikola Topic, the point guard from Europe, and Devin Carter, the guard from Providence. Let's start with Devin Carter, who checks a lot of boxes as far as quote-unquote needs that the Utah Jazz have. He is another guard, which the Jazz have some depth there. But had a really nice season at Providence. He's a little bit older, 22 years old, 19.7 points, 8.7 rebounds, which obviously is a spectacular number for guards, 3.6 assists, shot the ball very well, 47% from the floor, 37% from 3, 75% from the free throw line. There's a lot to like about Devin Carter, and some of the box score numbers really like him, and there are some things when you watch his game that I think are potentially red flags that may not allow him to be a prolific NBA player. He's awesome defensively, can guard both backcourt positions, might be able to guard even some smaller threes in the NBA, so that versatility would be good. The Jazz are not particularly good defensively in the backcourt, so a player like Devin Carter stepping in would help there. The idea of his three-point shot, which has, he can step out to the logo and shoot it, is really intriguing. I think you like that aspect of it. As I mentioned, 6'3", 6'9" wingspan, had one of the best vertical leaps in the draft, and it shows up when he plays, and he is really, really athletic. His dad is Anthony Carter. If you're a longtime NBA fan, you remember his dad playing for Denver and Miami and has been around for a long time. So he kind of understands what it takes to be an NBA player. I like all of those things. Where I think there's some question marks is he's not a point guard, but he's got a point guard body. Again, the 6'9" wingspan's great. The vertical leap is great. But we saw Donovan Mitchell step in and have this body and game to play shooting guard or the 2 guard and have the point guard height. And it's just, you can't overcome that. You can never overcome being small, regardless of how long your arms are or how high you can jump. It's just really hard to do. And adding another smaller player to the backcourt alongside Colin Sexton and Keontae George, both of whom are kind of point guards, kind of not. Adding another guy who's not a point guard and trying to just kind of piece that together, I think, is always difficult. At some point, you might need somebody to run the show to make life easier. That's kind of one of the red flags on Devin Carter. The other thing is his shooting. Even though you can look at his numbers and, he was 37% on all of his threes and 40% in catch and shoot and crazy number, 45% on guarded three-pointers. He was actually a better shooter when he was defended than he was unguarded. He's got a funky release, and he did not shoot the ball well his first 2 years of college. So he had a big jump his third year, and look, he shot a ton of threes, and he made a bunch of threes. So there's some reason to believe it, but his first 2 years he just did not shoot the ball well at all. I've got some questions if he ends up becoming a good three-point shooter in the NBA or above average, or if he just had a really great 30 games in college. I think those are big question marks, but I think he's definitely in the conversation for the Jazz at number 10. And you look at every mock draft, he's projected right there in that 8 to 12 range. So I'm sure the Jazz will take a very close look at him. He's not a very good passer. I really did not like his passing very much. He's not a very good ball handler. He didn't even run point guard all the time at Providence, despite the fact that with his height should be his natural position. They had another playmaker that they kind of relied on. I hated his team. I hated watching them play, but he had to do a lot. And he made the most of it. So if he ended up in Utah, he checks a lot of boxes as far as needs go. But I don't think it's some guarantee that he's a surefire, high-level NBA player, whereas the next guy I want to talk about I think has a better chance to hit some of those marks, and that's Nikola Topic, the European point guard I talked about. Good measurements stepping in, was in the conversation to be the top overall pick for long stretches of the season. I believe it was January. He ends up with a knee injury. He measures in at 6'7", 6'5" wingspan. That had been rumored to be a 7-foot wingspan and certainly never ended up being the case. But very cerebral basketball player, maybe the best passer in the draft. Really good in the pick and roll, which isn't a perfect fit for the Jazz. They don't run a lot of pick and roll, but I kind of believe in his first step and his size enough that he's going to be able to beat guys off the dribble. And then once he does, he's awesome finishing at the rim. He's awesome finding teammates all over the floor. He doesn't make a bunch of highlight reel passes. He's not one of these guys who's going out there and trying to showboat and go behind the back and do all these crazy passes. He just makes the right read every time, and wherever his guy or the person he's passing the ball to catches the ball, they seem to have an easy shot. And I like that. He makes hard plays look really easy, and whether he's running pick and roll and finding guys, it's like as soon as they catch it, they're open for a dunk or they're open for a three, and he just beats defenders' ability to recover with his passes. And I think he's a good enough passer that it might become contagious within an offense that he makes the first pass and you realize the ball's going to keep flying around because he has that type of belief. Again, at one point was viewed as the number one overall pick. He's only 18 years old, so he's super young. He's going to need a year probably to recover from that knee injury I mentioned in January. It was later revealed about a month ago that it was a torn ACL. So he's going to need time to recuperate, but I think he's awesome. And if you're in a spot where the Utah Jazz are right now, it's kind of exactly what you need. You need a guy who could be one of, if honestly not the best player in the draft, if it all goes right. Topic has that type of ability to be the best player in the draft, whereas Devin Carter, who I just talked about, I don't think he has the upside ever to be the best player in this draft. I think Topic does. You usually can't get him at 10. The Jazz didn't tank hard enough to get the top pick, and they didn't have lottery luck like Atlanta or like Houston. So you just got to have kind of these weird things happen and have all this context come into play where the best player falls to you and you select him at 10. That's what you need, and that situation could be coming true and coming to fruition with Nikola Topic. If he was on the board at 10, I would not hesitate to select him if I were the Utah Jazz. I think he's a pretty special player. Doesn't shoot the three well. That's really his big issue. If he shot the three more consistently, I think there'd be no question he'd be the top overall pick. just 30%. He did average 1 make a game, took nearly 4 a game. Good free throw shooter, 88%. I know a lot of people think those two are linked, and in some ways they are. You make your free throws, you've got some touch. I would remind you that Ricky Rubio was a great free throw shooter and couldn't shoot threes at all. And Ricky Rubio is a much better defensive player than Topic is. Topic has got to figure out that side of the ball a little bit more as well, but by no means a total zero. So the difference between those two guards, kind of interesting. But I liked Topic quite a bit. Watching him, of course, as long as you're comfortable with his knee injury and maybe even taking a year before you see him, which would allow you to tank again if you wanted to tank next year, and potentially you could have 2 really high-level rookies on the roster in the 25-26 season. Could be a pretty interesting setup for the Utah Jazz. Quickly, I'll just touch on 4 other guys I watched. I actually watched Duke play Baylor, and I've watched both of these teams quite a bit throughout the season. We'll talk about Jared McCain, who's right in that spot where the Jazz are going to be drafting. I don't think he's really a candidate at 10. Of course, I could be wrong there. Again, a small guard. Okay defensively, pretty good defensively, not elite defensively, certainly not to the level of Devin Carter. Great shooter, one of the better shooters in college basketball last year. If he's the type of shooter, if you leave him open, it's just going in. There's no question about it. He's not a point guard at all, but he's got a point guard body. Another really good rebounder for a freshman, 5 rebounds a game. Equal assist-to-turnover ratio, essentially. Very solid. He's going to be a solid player. I think he's going to naturally draw some comparisons to like Seth Curry. I don't think that's totally appropriate, but they both went to Duke. He's a better defensive player than Seth Curry is, but that kind of small, undersized shooter that's going to play a long time in the NBA. I think that's who Jared McCain is. Kyle Filipowski is going to be a probably career backup center, backup big man, maybe the third big. Has a chance to be a really special third big, and we've seen how valuable those guys are. I'm not going to compare him to Naz Reid. Naz Reid has turned into a very special player for Minnesota, but remember, he went undrafted because he kind of didn't do traditional big man things. I think that's who Kyle Filipowski is. He does everything else, and he's awesome at everything else. He can rebound the ball and dribble up the floor. He's an awesome passer. He has great footwork. He's bizarrely has terrific hands defensively, so he records a lot of steals. And even though he averages a block and a half a game, it's really actually on a per-minute basis not very good. I don't believe in his scoring a ton, especially inside the post. I just don't think he's strong enough to bang down there, but he might get bigger. And his three-point shooting at 35% was good. It's not awesome, but it's good enough, and I think he projects as a pretty good three-point shooter. So I do think you have a little bit of a Naz Reid, Kelly Olynyk type of, ideally not your starter in the front court, but kind of your third guy. And if he's your third guy, you're probably pretty good. If Kyle Filipowski were to fall in the draft, I mean, he's been projected as high as 12 was a common name for him to Oklahoma City. If he were to fall to like 30, 29 where the Jazz are, I think you take him, no questions asked. I think he's a really good player. He actually went back to college last year, probably wouldn't have been a first rounder at Duke last season, went back to improve his draft stock and just didn't do it, but not because he didn't play well, but just because he's just kind of has some of those flaws. He's not going to be a great defensive player. He's never going to be a starter, I don't think. But I suspect he's in the NBA for a long time. So I would take a swing on Kyle Filipowski at 29 if he was on the board if I were the Utah Jazz. The Baylor side of it, Jacoby Walter, a top 10 recruit in the country, burst onto the scene. His first 13 games, he looked like a potential top 5 pick at Baylor. And then his last 20 games, he totally fell off. He couldn't shoot at all. Doesn't finish inside the paint. He's a super athletic wing who projects as a 3-and-D player, but only, again, shot, 35% from the three-point line in college. Shot 37% from the floor, which is really bad for a player with his physical gifts. 6'5", huge vertical, great wingspan, has the frame, but the numbers just never panned out. Made some really nice passes that I liked, but got beat a lot off the dribble defensively. Just didn't do the 3-and-D things that you're looking for from a 3-and-D wing. If you're really patient with him, with his size and his tools, and apparently his work ethic is very good. That's the kind of belief is that Scott Drew really loved him at Baylor, and you want to let him develop for a couple of years, he might be worthwhile. I don't know if I would take him at number 10, and he's kind of slipped in the draft. He was projected right in that range pretty squarely for a while, but doesn't seem like he's impressed a ton in his draft workouts and has not moved back up boards. I still wouldn't be surprised if he ends up in the lottery, though, just because his tools are pretty unique. It's the type of guy that in a mediocre draft like this one, I think you take a swing on. 6'5", as I mentioned, 6'10" wingspan, 38-inch vertical, and has some burst. Doesn't get anywhere with the dribble, but you can see it when you watch. He does look like an NBA player which I think matters. And then finally, Yves Missy is the center at Baylor. Started playing basketball like 3 years ago. Super athletic, 7 feet tall, only a 7'2" wingspan, so doesn't have elite measurements in that front. Actually can do some weird stuff off the dribble, which you didn't see a lot at Baylor, but when he did, I thought he was pretty intriguing. Really, his effort level comes and goes. When he's engaged, he's awesome. And then there's a lot of times where he's just not that engaged. I think that's reflected in his poor rebounding numbers, which is always a little bit of a red flag for me. If you've listened to this podcast, I talk a lot about rebounding and how I think that's such a good sign, which, going back to Devin Carter, I think is a really good sign for him. I like guys that are engaged and read the game and read the ball well. You don't see that. And that makes sense for a guy who just started playing basketball 3 years ago. Yves Missy, again, probably not in the conversation for the Jazz. Certainly not in the conversation at 10. I doubt he's on the board at 30. He's probably worth, or at 29, where the Jazz are picking, he's probably worth a shot at 29 if he's on the board. I actually liked Filipowski a little bit better. I think Missy will get drafted ahead of him because he's got better physical tools, and the NBA draft is a physical lottery. That's what you're looking for. You're looking for genetics, and I think that Yves Missy has him. I think both those guys will be in the NBA for a while. I think all 4 of these guys I talked about actually end up making the NBA and sticking, because this is a funny draft where we say it's a bad draft. The top 5 aren't very good, but after that I think you're going to see a lot of NBA players, and coincidentally, the last time we saw a draft like this was 2013, and you had a lot of those guys do the same thing. Rudy Gobert's still in the NBA, still at a high level, Giannis at a very high level, but the Steven Adamses of the world, the Kelly Olynyk's of the world, CJ McCollums, there are going to be those guys. So we talk about, not great defensive centers. Well, that's Kelly Olynyk. That's Kyle Filipowski. Undersized shooters. Well, C.J. McCollum is still in the NBA. Those were his red flags coming out of college as well, and he's still in the NBA. So you're going to find some good players here in the draft and going to be some options for the Utah Jazz. All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we will get to the mailbag. Stick around. More Jazz Notes coming up next. Welcome back to the Jazz Notes podcast. I'm your host, Ben Anderson. Again, as always, find me on Twitter at Ben's Hoops. A lot of Jazz coverage really every day. But also, every Tuesday I send out my prompt that we're going to be recording this podcast. So if you have a Jazz question, you want to have it answered, the best way to do it is to respond to that prompt. Let's get started quickly. This is kind of an NBA draft question, also a little bit of a BYU question, so we'll move quickly on this. Nick T. asks, any insight on how Yegor Dioman and Cannon Catchings project in the 2025 draft? I just looked at a mock draft today. If you don't know, those are 2 highly recruited players that landed at BYU under their new coach, Kevin Young. Dioman's expected to be a lottery pick, Catching in the 20s. That doesn't mean anything. It's awesome. You could go back and just Google search way too early 2024 NBA mock draft, and the top 2 picks on basically everybody's board are going to be Isaiah Collier and Ron Holland, and Collier's probably going to go in the 20s, and Holland's probably going to go in the teens. So just because you're projected in that spot now doesn't really mean a whole lot 12 months from now, and it's going to be on BYU to prove that they can win and that those guys can actually play, and that's a difficult thing to do with freshmen. All right, let's get into some Utah Jazz and NBA talk. It's not Ryan, it's Ryan. Says, Danny said they didn't want 3 rookies, or 3 20-year-olds next season on the roster in addition to the young players they already have. Do you anticipate them consolidating picks, or what's the expectation going into the draft? Yes, I expect them to consolidate at least in some fashion. I don't expect them to make 3 picks. I still don't quite have a total understanding of what that value of having the second pick of the second round on the second night of the NBA draft, how much that helps you. I do think having a whole night of GMs selling themselves on who that number 32 overall pick is really valuable. And look, I look at a team like Phoenix, and I've written about this before in previous mailbags. Phoenix has the 22nd overall pick, I believe. If I'm the Suns, and this is a relatively flat draft, again, you're going to like the player at 22 more than you like at 29 most likely. But if I'm the Suns, I might prefer to take, 29 and 32 from the Jazz because they are so cash-strapped and have so little ability to have any wiggle room. I might try and trade 22 for 29 and 32 and say, well, the Jazz don't want to add 3 players. We need as many young players as we can just to fill out the roster that have some upside and might fill needs because they view themselves as being close to winning a title, or maybe they just want the 29th pick, or maybe they just want the 32nd pick, speaking of Phoenix, and they trade the 29th pick for another future first-round draft pick that's, top 20 protected, but just to have some wiggle room and just to add another trade piece. And the Jazz could say, well, yeah, we don't want to draft 29, we don't want to draft 32, but somebody we had on the board at 15 is still on the board at 22. Ron Holland has shockingly fallen down the board. Jazz had him at 12, but the guy they had at 10 obviously was still on the board, so they took him. And now this guy that they think is a really good value play that certainly is not going to be on the board at 29 or 32 is available at 22, and they trade up and get him, And that could be, as I mentioned, that could be Zach Edey. That could be Justin Edwards. That could be Tyler Kolek. That could be any number of players that are projected in the second round of the first, or the second half of the first round that are still on the board at 22 where the Jazz find some value. And Phoenix says, well, we need Ryan Dunn and we need Baylor Shireman to step in and be more, ready to play players. I could absolutely see that happening. So I would keep an eye on that. If not, don't be surprised if the Jazz just, punt a draft pick for a future draft pick. The team says, yeah, we need the 32nd overall pick. We don't have a pick this year, or we don't have a second pick this year, and there's a guy on the board we think is going to be there. We really want it. And the Jazz say, fine, give us 2 future second-round picks for this 1 second-round pick this year. I could see that happening as well. So I absolutely predict some trades for the Jazz on draft night, which I think is always exciting for Jazz fans. Speaking of trades, got a couple of questions. Denny on Twitter asks, and Jazz Time Jones asks, basically, what are the most likely trade rumors for the Jazz this summer? The names I think you hear are not surprising. John Collins and Jordan Clarkson, I think, are going to be 2 of the most common names that get thrown around. Now, the most common name you're going to hear is actually Lauri Markkanen. I don't think the Jazz are going to trade Lauri, barring some weird situation where he absolutely indicates that he's not going to re-sign with the team either this year on an extension or next year when he would become a free agent. I just don't see the Jazz trading Lauri. I don't see that happening. So I would look at the obvious veterans that don't really, quote-unquote, match the timeline. Jordan Clarkson in that sense. John Collins does kind of match the timeline, but he was an awkward fit, and the Jazz tried to work around it all year. It's the same problem Atlanta had with him, but he had a good season. So, you don't need to get $25 million back in value for John Collins. That's what he cost. But you may just need to say, well, the Jazz essentially traded Rudy Gay and a second-round pick that's probably never going to convey to Atlanta for John Collins. You just need something more valuable than that, and you won that trade. You upgraded Rudy Gay to whatever. So I could see that happening. Now, can you find somebody who feels like they need John Collins? The problem the Jazz had with him is the same problem Atlanta had with him, is the same problem the next team will have with him. But is there a team that needs a super athletic front court player who is up and down, kind of a tweener, might be a center, might be a forward, definitely isn't a 3 in the NBA, might shoot well, might not shoot well, kind of plays defense, kind of doesn't play defense. There's just a lot of ups and downs with John Collins, and I think that's always a hard fit. What type of a team would need that? Of course, that changes dramatically once you start throwing in draft picks and what the Jazz are willing to add into that conversation. And that's hard to predict what the Jazz could get back. But those are the 2 names I'd keep an eye on. Jordan Clarkson's name has always been thrown around, and John Collins' name has been on the trade block wherever he's been for the last 4 seasons. So I wish there was more concrete news there, but those are the names I would certainly keep an eye on. I think people would ask about Colin Sexton. Colin's 24 and plays extremely well and is playing, maybe the best basketball of his career over the last 50 games of the season. He had better stats in Cleveland, but I just think he saw kind of some buy-in, some total understanding of what was being asked of him from Will Hardy, and I thought he really played pretty spectacularly well over the last 50 games. So I would hold on to Colin and try and see what he has to offer, unless there was an obvious can't-miss upside pick or trade coming back for Colin Sexton. I don't think I'd put him in those draft conversations or trade conversations. Gregory Gibb on Twitter. Have you done a Jazz-specific mock draft with Ryan Smith allowing Danny Ainge to do Danny Ainge things? Anything could happen. Who would your top lottery draft picks be for the Jazz? I don't do a big board, but let me just do this. I will pull up kind of a list of the prospects, and I will go fit for the Jazz with the understanding that there is one player in the top 10 who I just haven't watched because he's not going to be on the board for the Jazz, so I didn't really feel it necessary to watch. Alexander Sarr would be an awesome fit for the Jazz. I have watched him. Big, athletic, rim runner who I actually think is going to end up being able to shoot the 3 a little bit, does some stuff with the ball in his hands, his ability to attack. I do believe Alexander Sarr, if I had the number 1 overall pick, that's probably who I would take. He absolutely fits the Jazz. I have not watched Zachary Rizache play Hardly at all. I watched one broadcast when it was live, which is kind of hard to watch guys live, and I got it. Great measurements. I saw him attack some closeouts a couple of times. Didn't seem to do a whole lot with the ball in his hands as far as self-creation. And then everything I've read and listened to kind of mimics what I had seen, but I have not done a quote-unquote deep dive on him. Yes, he would fit on the Jazz. And considering he's number 1 or 2 on every board, I would just believe those experts there. I would take Reed Sheppard. If I had the number 1 overall pick, I would probably take Sarr. I might take Reed Sheppard number 2. I'm a huge Reed Sheppard believer. The shooting numbers are too good to pass on, in my opinion. And then his instincts defensively. I know some of his physical tools don't allow him to be an elite defensive player. He's only 6'1", 6'2". He's only 185 pounds or whatever it was at the combine. I love his athleticism. I love the way he passes the ball, not just his passing numbers, though they were very good. I love the way he passes the ball. He's always playing forward. He gets off the ball really quickly to move the ball into the front court for outlet passes. He just is a perfect modern NBA player outside of the fact that he's a little short. But Reed Sheppard, if I were a trade-up, if I were trying to trade up, let's say, to number 3 at Houston, I would absolutely go up and grab Reed Sheppard in this draft. I think he's going to be really good. I don't know if he's going to be the best player. If I had to take Reed Sheppard or the field, I would certainly take the field in this draft. But Reed Sheppard is as close to I guess I would say can't-miss player in this draft. In my opinion, I really, really like him. I think he's going to be pretty special. I talked about Nikola Topic already. I think he might be 4, 5 on my board. Then you start getting into some weird fits. Donovan Clingan, I don't love Clingan as much. I might be a little bit lower on him than some of the other people. I know there's conversations he's going to go to the Hawks number 1 overall. I don't think he's going to be the best player from this draft class. I get it. He's safe. He blocks shots. He rebounds. He's got some touch as a passer. He scored really well at UConn. UConn won back-to-back titles. With him, probably maybe he wasn't their best player last year, but he's up there. I mean, he's pretty spectacular as far as winning goes. He's huge, 7'3", 280 pounds. I get it. I don't think he's going to be like an awesome NBA player. I don't know if he's going to be a top 5 center in the NBA, but he could be top 10. I would say the same thing about Alex Sarr. Stephen Castle, love the measurables, love the defense, not a huge believer in his jump shot. Like that he dunked in the half court quite a bit, even though it doesn't have great dunk numbers. If you watched him, it just seems like he was at the rim all the time. Like his soft touch, as I mentioned, there's some Jimmy Butler in his game. Maybe I'd go Sarr 1, Reza Shea 2, Sheppard 3. I might go Sheppard 2 actually over Reza Shea, to be honest with you. Let's go Clingan 4. No, let's go Topic 4, Castle 5, Cody Williams 6. I like Cody Williams. I like his size. I like that. I know he didn't shoot the 3 a lot. He made it. They went in when he shot it. It's a small sample size. He still knocked it down. I like the NBA bloodline. He was a big recruit in high school because he was good in high school too. I get he's a little bit passive. I almost wonder if he was, mocked as a top overall pick early in the season, got hurt and said, let's just not make that worse and let's get drafted, and that's all that we have to worry about. I would probably do Cody Williams 5 or 6, right in that range. Ron Holland, maybe 7. Dalton Connect 8. Again, I'm just trying to do this off the top of my head. I apologize. Maybe Modest Buzelis 9. Devin Carter 10. Oh, you know who I haven't talked about, who I did watch, and I wrote him up as well. I apologize. Tajon Salon. I would absolutely take him in the top 10. No question about it. The forward out of Cholet in France. Incredible physical tools. I should have talked about him earlier. I apologize. That was a mistake on my part. He's awesome. I wrote about him last Friday. He's exactly where the modern NBA is going. He didn't do a lot with the ball in his hands, attack some closeout, but the flashes of brilliance are so high at a player who's 6'10", with his athleticism. It's not like top tier athleticism, but it's really high for a player his size. And some of his defensive tools are really intriguing as well. He's going to take a while. He's a huge upside swing, and his downside is he might not be an NBA player, but his upside is as high as basically anybody in this draft. In fact, I won't be surprised if he goes off the board before the Jazz even get a chance to pick him. He would be in the conversation for me as well. He'd probably be right there behind Topic, so like 5, 6, right there with Cody Williams, in my opinion. again, I kind of like this draft of those players I mentioned, 6 through 12, 6 through 11. If the Jazz were to walk away, if I were a Jazz fan, and they walked away with Topic, Cody Williams, Ron Holland, Dalton Connect, Tijon Salon, like I just mentioned, 5 players there, man, I think you're pretty happy. And, I don't think Stephen Castle's on the board. Manas Buzelis you're probably happy with. I didn't love his film when I watched him. Again, everybody who watches a ton of G League basketball, has done the draft a lot, really does like him. So I get it there. He's not my favorite prospect that I've watched, but I get the physical tools there. And if he can develop as a power forward, I don't think he's a ball-in-hand wing or small forward. But if he can develop to play a little bit bigger, I kind of like him, and I get the perspective there. All right, that was a long answer that meandered that probably didn't actually answer your question. So I promise. I apologize. I just talked a lot of different names there. Sammy Paradise on Twitter says, have all the Jazz assistant coaching positions been filled? Could you see them going after any of the Boston assistants? I do think with the last round of promotions, I wrote about it early last week. There was like 15 names that got promoted, even things like who's the new head chef for the Jazz. A lot of things like that have been moved around. Sean Sheldon, who's Lauri Markkanen's coach, works with them at practice, is now not in the second row. He's moved up to the front of the bench. I think Scott Morrison, who was the G League coach 2 years ago and was an assistant last year, is the Jazz's kind of number 2 guy. If Will Hardy ever gets thrown out of a game, which he joked about late in the season last year, he has not done it yet. If he gets tossed, I could see him moving up to being the Jazz head coach or temporary head coach for the rest of the game. And then, Jason Terry's still there. So those are kind of the top assistants I view for the Utah Jazz, and they've just had a bunch of guys who have hung around. I know a couple guys left as well, but I think that's probably what it looks like. I don't think the Jazz are going to continue to add more assistant coaches, though there's always room to, pick up a piece here or there, add a video guy, add an analytics guy, or woman, I should say. Those are always in the conversation. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I don't think you're going to see, some major swing, some major move. But I could be wrong. Guys get fired, recommendations, you do favors for people. You add somebody to come in and bring experience, and some guys you just are smart and you like to have around. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I'm not waiting for the Jazz to, quote-unquote, fill an empty spot on the coaching staff. Finally, this comes from Craig. He asked, what free agents do the Jazz have interest in? Again, Danny Ainge, Justin Zanuck have all said they want needle movers. They just want guys who are going to come in and make you better. I will go off of a list here, and then I'll add a name from Bobby Marks at ESPN. He said free agents who fit with the Jazz, and I'll just run through this list quickly. Tyus Jones, point guard. Miles Bridges, obviously the troubled off the court forward who's extraordinarily productive in Charlotte. He's not done a lot of winning, and then had the pled no contest to domestic assault. A lot of Jazz fans don't want him in Utah, and I don't blame them. If you don't want to have those players in your community, I don't blame you at all. Isaac Okoro, I think, is a pretty interesting name. Had a pretty good year last year in Cleveland. He's at the end of his rookie deal, and is kind of finally figuring it out. Former lottery pick, projects as a 3-and-D player. I don't know if he's ever going to be really special, but sometimes those guys take a little while and can be impactful. Isaac Okoro actually, I think, makes some sense. Najee Marshall, Markelle Fultz is a name that's been common with the Jazz. If you're looking for a veteran point guard to step in and play and still has some burst, some pop, but obviously not the upside. He's not much of a shooter. Bruce Brown Jr., I'll be curious. He's not really a free agent. I think Toronto is going to pick up his player option and then try to trade him, when I wouldn't rule out the Jazz as a potential trade partner there. Caleb Martin, Josh Richardson, Derek Jones, kind of some older shooter, 3-and-D types. Royce O'Neal, a familiar name, though I'm sure Phoenix is going to re-sign him. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, two-time champion there at shooting guard, just getting looks for some money, and then Jazz could pay him and try and trade him to a team that feels like they're contending, that needs that extra piece to get over the top. He might make sense in that department. D'Angelo Russell, I don't see. Gary Trent Jr., I think there's some potential there. And then Kelly Oubre Jr., who I would imagine sticks around in Philadelphia because they have all the cap space in the world and only 2 players on their roster. Now it's Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid, but I thought Kelly Oubre was pretty good last year. And I think they would keep him around. The other name I would throw to this list, which a rumor comes out today, I don't totally believe it, I think he's going to stay in New York, is OG Anunoby. OG's just a very good player. And when he's healthy, now that's a big when, it's a big if, he's exactly the type of player I think you want to put next to Lauri Markkanen. He's not a traditional star, but he's one of the top, I don't want to call him a role player, but he's just one of the top kind of role players, non-all-stars in the NBA. He's awesome defensively, can score certainly. He was only at 14.7 points per game, but shot really efficiently, 49% from the floor, 38% from three, 75% from the free throw line. So you look at a stat line by itself, and it doesn't always look awesome, but you kind of get a feel for it when you watch him play, how good he is defensively, how many winning plays he makes. He's only 26 years old, so he's right there with Lowry Markkanen. I actually think he would make a ton of sense. And that's a guy, if the Jazz just said, we want to spend money, we don't want to be a cellar dweller, we want to win some games, we want to try and compete for a playoff spot and start piecing together what this team might look like for the next 3 or 4 years, I think OG Anunoby would be a great addition for the Utah Jazz. I know I've seen some on Twitter, not everyone feels that way. If he's healthy, he's a pretty big-time player. He misses a lot of games in his career. I mean, he played 50 this year, played 67 last year, played 48 the year before that, 43 the year before that. He just, because of his style of play, which is very aggressive, very physical, he has not lasted very long. And then he's coming off of a year where he played a lot for the New York Knicks, and they ran him into the ground, and he wasn't really available in the playoffs as a result. So you got to be careful with that type of thing. But if you could get him in Utah on the right deal and he were to stay healthy, I think he's a big-time difference maker. That's a good free agent list name. I don't mind that at all. I've also thrown out, Kyle Anderson potentially from Minnesota as a veteran to come in and just kind of teach guys how to play. He knows how to play. He's played a lot of places. He probably wouldn't cost a whole lot of money. Another name I would throw onto that list. All right, that'll do it for the Jazz Notes podcast. Just under an hour today, really under about 45 minutes. So appreciate you tuning in. As always, next week we'll have a big pre-draft edition. Chandler Holt should be back, so stick around. More Jazz Notes coming up next week.